contains content and images that many may find disturbing and certainly not suitable for children. We believe the program addresses important issues that impact the church and society, but viewer discretion is strongly advised.
The following is an EWTN special presentation.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through Him, and without Him nothing came to be. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said to the darkness, "Let there be light." And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from the waters." And God called the firmament heaven. And God said, "Let the dry land appear. Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants, and fruit trees, yielding seed, each according to its kind upon the earth. Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures in the seas, and all kinds of birds to fly above the earth, across the firmament of the heavens. Let the earth bring forth living creatures, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth, all according to their kinds. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image and likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over all the earth. Everything that has the breath of life." What has happened to our world? Why are so many people suffering and confused? Why is there so much death? Why have we abandoned so much of our history and our tradition? This hasn't happened overnight. It's taken centuries to tear down Christian civilization and God's laws, which have been followed since the beginning of time. But what is the greatest attack we face today? What is it, and where is it coming from? For 2 centuries, the ideologues of socialism or communism have used deceptive word jugglery to rebrand themselves as liberals or progressives, becoming wolves in sheep's clothing. Wolves who have infiltrated our institutions with the Gnostic cultural Marxist movement that has reordered our traditional biblical understanding of nature, marriage, and family. Paul Kengor is a professor of political science at Grove City College, executive director of the Center for Vision and Values, and visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is an acclaimed New York Times best-selling author of over a dozen books. His book, Takedown, is a shocking chronology of how the far left has sought to destroy traditional sex differences, marriage, and family, culminating in its embrace of same-sex marriage.
So really, in the end, what is the agenda? What's the goal here? And the agenda is basically that ye shall be as gods. So they in the role of God, small g gods, because when you can come up with your own definitions of things that heretofore had been the total province of the laws of nature and nature's God, and you render unto yourself the ability to redefine something that heretofore God had defined that, and you say that you can now do that, well, here again, back to the Garden of Eden, this is the first mistake. Ye shall be as gods. So you are making yourself your own God. And I cannot do that. I'm going to have enough to answer for. That's one that I don't want to have to answer for. The most fascinating and frustrating thing about cultural Marxism is that people don't even know what it is. And a lot of people that are pursuing those ends have no idea of it. So if you go up to somebody and say, this is really a kind of a Marcusean, Antonio Gramsci, Wilhelm Reich, sexual revolution, Frankfurt School, kind of cultural Marxist thing you're doing here, they'll look at you like you're out of your mind. Cultural Marxism today is more often referred to as critical theory. And there are many colleges in America that have critical theory programs and departments. In fact, our president of fundamental transformation, Barack Obama, went to Occidental College, which has a department of critical theory and social justice. Queer theory, phrase that they use, all of this which falls under the umbrella of critical theory. In a way, I like the phrase critical theory better than cultural Marxism, because really what they're doing is criticizing everything. And everything that at least heretofore existed as what we understood in the Judeo-Christian West as a moral absolute. And what they really mean by critical in terms of critical theory is destroying. So not even just criticizing it, but redefining it, taking it down, destroying it, deconstructing it, taking it apart. They took classical Marxism, which under Marx and Engels was an economic model The cultural Marxists took all of this and looked at it not through the prism of economics and class, but through culture and sex in particular. They established, of all things, a form of Freudian Marxism. Culture would be the goal. Culture, culture, culture. Sex, 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 education, education, education. For them, their world could be the university classroom. That's where the cultural revolution could and would take place.
This film tells the story of a number of new wolves in sheep's clothing, ravenous men and women who seek to destroy our faith and future. False prophets with a clear and present gender agenda to destroy our families and corrupt our children by redefining the very nature and sacred dignity of being a man and woman made in God's image and likeness. Let us begin. By their fruits you will know them. Simone de Beauvoir was born in 1908 into a Paris, France middle-class home. Her father, Georges, was a staunch atheist. Her mother, Françoise, a devout Catholic. Simone, as a child, was openly religious. For a time, she even considered becoming a nun. As she grew older, she grew closer and closer to her father. Though ironically, she claimed her father never once embraced her. Simone thinks like a man, her father constantly boasted, and which she enjoyed him saying. At his death, he refused to see a priest. At age 14, she decided that she didn't believe in God.
One night, I summoned God, if he really existed, to show himself to me. He didn't, and I never addressed another word to him. I loved the world, and it was suddenly God whose price was small. Literature took the place in my life occupied by religion, and it absorbed me entirely and transfigured my life. One afternoon, in Paris, I realized that I was condemned to death. I was alone in the house, and I did not attempt to control my despair. I screamed and tore at the red carpet.
As a young girl, Simone came to view her parents' marriage as disunity, and that her mother was imprisoned by homemaking, while her father was free. Thus she called father the transcendent one, and her mother the immanent one. She came to see self and other, marriage and love, matter and spirit, holiness and intelligence, nature and culture, man and woman, all to be complete radical contradictions.
By limiting women to tiresome, empty, monotonous household tasks, marriage mutilates and annihilates the wife. In marriage, her life is virtually finished forever. Society, being codified by man, decrees that woman is inferior. She can do away with this inferiority only by destroying male's superiority.
De Beauvoir embraced Karl Marx's evil dualistic conflict theory of oppressor and oppressed that would polarize our society and shape our culture of death.
In the Communist Manifesto, you see statements like this: abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. Wow, 1848, abolition of the family was already an infamous proposal of the communists? I mean, this is the programmatic statement, the manifesto of the Communist Party. And already then, even before the manifesto was out, this was known as an infamous proposal of the communists. And they say, one paragraph after that, the bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. And then get this, do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime, we plead guilty.
Simone's rejection of religion led her to study and teach philosophy and to write her first novels. De Beauvoir chose as the epitaph of her first novel the words of Karl Marx's master, Friedrich Hegel. Each consciousness pursues the death of the other. Since the other, for de Beauvoir, would be motherhood in Western civilization. Birth control and abortion would become for her the sacraments of her lifestyle. Simone met Jean-Paul Sartre in 1929 at the Sorbonne in Paris, and soon after moved in with him. His relationship became the greatest influence on her life and work. Sartre was a philosopher, playwright, novelist, and political activist. His novel, Nausea, is in some ways the modern manifesto of atheistic existentialism, one without a God and no human nature, except the one which she alone would design. Sartre is called the philosopher of the 20th century, fitting for the death of God century that would shape the greatest genocidal holocaust in the history of the world.
Existentialism is nothing else than an attempt to draw all the consequences of a coherent atheistic position. Man is nothing else than what he makes of himself. To choose to be this or that is to affirm at the same time the value of what we choose, because we can never choose evil. Without God, all things are permissible.
Key to de Beauvoir's life and influence was that she would agree with what Sartre's book, Being and Nothingness, demonstrated. That
essence does not precede existence. In pure subjectivity, the human being is not anything. He is measured by his acts.
Dr. Paul Vitz is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at New York University and Senior Scholar and Professor of the Institute for Psychological Sciences at Divine Mercy University in Arlington, Virginia. His work focuses primarily on the relationship between modern psychology and Christianity. The author of many books, his work, Sigmund Freud's Christian Unconscious, offers the historical and biographical evidence for Freud's deep, lifelong rejection of Catholicism. His latest book, Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism, focuses on the importance of fatherhood. His current research is centered on the complementarity of the sexes.
Sartre said that essence did not precede existence. And what he wanted to get rid of was that there were essential qualities that were essentially bound up in the nature of a thing's existence. And so he said that existence comes before or precedes essence. And therefore, your existence comes before who you are or what your essence is.
Sartre was an apologist for tyranny and terror. He was a supporter of Stalin, Mao, and Castro. Sartre's ideas inspired the Khmer Rouge leadership and the events in Cambodia in the 1970s, in which between 1/5 and 1/3 of the nation was starved to death or murdered. This was the work of a group of intellectuals who were, for the most part, pupils and admirers of Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre called for violence and death in his preface to Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, endorsing his devotees' neo-colonial Marxism that would later devastate Africa. Robert Riley is a writer and senior fellow at the American Policy Council in Washington and director of the Westminster Institute in McLean, Virginia. Under the Reagan administration, he served as senior advisor for public diplomacy at the U.S. Embassy in Switzerland, and later in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He is the author of many books, including Making Gay Okay: How Rationalizing Homosexual Behavior is Changing Everything.
Simone de Beauvoir's paramour, Jean-Paul Sartre, gave the philosophical principle behind this that eventually devolved into the transgender self-mutilation. And that is that existence precedes essence. Now, one would have to have studied a little metaphysics to understand the consequences of such a statement. Existence precedes essence means that you somehow exist without a nature. You're not anything, really, which leaves you in a very precarious situation, and thus the angst of existentialism. So how do you become something if you have existence but no essence? Well, you have to obtain an essence through your own will. So what becomes paramount is will rather than reason. Reason was there to apprehend the nature of reality, but if existence precedes essence, there is no nature of reality, and will becomes paramount. And this, of course, is the key of the 20th century ideologies, totalitarian ideologies, which for Hitler was triumph of the will on a race-based theory of man, or the communist class-based theory of man, both of them based on the primacy of will as against reason. So what we're seeing today in the transgender and the whole LGBT agenda is downstream from Sartre and de Beauvoir, just living out the full implications of what it means if you exist before you have an essence.
De Beauvoir lived with Sartre. Breaking with moral traditions, they never married, seeking a freedom outside monogamy. Their so-called open relationship gave them license to form all kinds of sexual relationships with others, both men and women.
I blamed us. Myself as much as you, actually. In the past, in the future, in the absolute, the way we treat people. I felt it was unacceptable.
In his diaries, Sartre wrote that he enjoyed being a scholarly Don Juan, slaying women through the power of my golden tongue. Nothing struck me as more moving than the moment at which the avowal of love is finally wrenched forth. After that would happen, he rarely knew what to do with his conquests.
In itself, homosexuality is as limiting as heterosexuality. The idea should be to be capable of loving a woman or a man either a human being, without feeling fear, restraint, or obligation. I am too intelligent, too demanding, too resourceful for anyone to take charge of me entirely. No one knows me or loves me completely. I have only myself.
Simone never had children. She kept a kind of bond with Sartre as long as he lived. The philosopher Merleau-Ponty turned on its head the classical view of the human person, with a hierarchy, a primacy to God over soul and its faculties of memory, intellect, and will over the body. Merleau-Ponty eliminated God and gave primacy to the body and feelings, to what he termed embodiment and the flesh of the world, giving elite academic credence to the dumbing down of culture.
The body is our anchorage in the world. I am not in front of my body, I am in it, or rather I am it. If we can still speak of interpretation in relation to the perception of one's own body, we shall have to say that it interprets itself. We know not through our intellect, but through our experience.
The outbreak of World War II in 1939 and the German occupation of France in 1940 also contributed to her philosophical perspective.
Robots over France are direct targets for our gunners. New weapons of war add to the increasing thrills recorded by intrepid cameramen.
From 1943 to 1944, during the Nazi occupation of France, de Beauvoir, without coercion and with other options, chose freely to work for Radio Vichy, the communications pawn in France for the National Socialist Party. Dr. Ingrid Galster, an expert on Simone de Beauvoir, termed her job as a sound director in the Nazi propaganda machine to be at the very least subtle collaboration. The Telegraph also reported that the reason she couldn't keep her teaching job was her procuring for Jean-Paul Sartre's pedophilia addiction. In 1943, Simone de Beauvoir was fired for her behavior leading to the corruption of a minor.
Absurdity challenges every ethics. But also, the finished rationalization of the real would leave no room for ethics. It is because man's condition is ambiguous that he seeks through failure and outrageousness to save his existence. I feel something inside of me which scares me, an exhausting violence. But I accept the great adventure of being me.
After the war, through Les Temps Modernes, the monthly journal founded by she and Sartre in 1945, they attempted to create a cultural Marxist socialism, one less dependent on the brutal, bloody forms of World War II.
Equality between men and women will be possible when the socialist society is realized worldwide. When there would no longer be men and women, but only workers, equal with one another. Formerly, I thought that the class struggle had to happen before the struggle between the sexes. Now, I find it necessary to lead them both together. The fact is that men encounter more complicity in their women companions than the oppressor usually finds in the oppressed. And in bad faith, they use it as a pretext to declare that a woman wanted the destiny that a man imposed on her.
De Beauvoir's The Second Sex was published in 1949. It called for the moral revolution of existentialism, which reverses the principle that essence precedes existence.
One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and unique, which is described as feminine.
In her book, she explains how women's liberation is intimately related to the fate of socialism.
As socialism, true socialism, establishes economic equality among all peoples, the feminist movement learned it had to establish equality between the sexes by taking power away from the ruling class within the movement, that is, from men. Put another way, once inside the class struggle, women understood the class struggle does not eliminate the sex struggle.
While she was writing Second Sex, de Beauvoir was editing the Marxist journal Modern Times. Throughout her life, she and Sartre exhibited their support for communism, especially for the Frankfurt School's critical theory, its sexual revolution, and multiculturalism. They traveled together to visit Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, and Castro's Cuba. The Second Sex initiated the anti-creation movement to undermine the dignity of life, nature, and human nature. Life becomes dominated by the will to power. Thus, we see the emergence of what the popes have called the dictatorship of relativism and ideological colonization. Ryan T. Anderson is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Ryan's latest book, When Harry Becomes Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment, attempts to give what the National Review calls a measured perspective of the current gender crisis.
You know, I quote one activist in the book saying that biological sex is a social construct. The way that this originally came up was that they said gender is a social construct and that sex is merely a biological fact. So originally they were gonna say, look, sex, whether you're XX or XY, whether you have male genitalia or female genitalia, that's merely biology, but that's different than gender, which is a social construct. Now they're saying everything is a social construct, even biological sex. And so they're saying that gender identity determines someone's sex. Sex is merely assigned at birth, but it could be misassigned. So later in life, you can have sex reassignment, surgery, hormones, and all of the rest. It's a vision of reality that says there are no truths baked into reality. There are no truths about human nature. There's no truths about nature writ large. That's very different than the American founding, right, which said that there are certain laws of nature and nature's God, that saw faith and reason going together, that saw philosophy and theology, science and the Bible forming a coherent whole, revealing truths to us, not merely will to power from a certain Nietzschean perspective, not merely social construction, that there are actually truths embedded in reality that we could discover and that we could then live in accordance with. That's a very different vision than saying we just construct reality according to our own desires.
In 1977, de Beauvoir, accompanied by a large contingent of Marxist French intelligentsia, signed a petition which demanded the legalization of pedophilia. It required the immediate release of 3 individuals due to serve long jail sentences for sexually abusing boys and girls aged 11 to 14. De Beauvoir and Sartre signed the petition. Published in the newspaper Le Monde, Their petition said this of pedophilia: a simple vice affair where the children have not been victims of the slightest violence, who consented, although the law at present denies them their right to consent, who today risk to be sentenced to a long prison term, either for having had sexual relations with minors, boys as well as girls, or for having encouraged and taken photographs of their sexual plays. The designation as a crime, which serves to legitimatize such a severity, and the facts themselves. Even more so, the antiquated law and the reality of everyday life in a society which claims to know about the sexuality of children and adolescents.
The great Simone. She was really something. She and Jean-Paul Sartre in this little world, this little coven they created on the left bank in Paris.
Mallory Millett is a former left-wing radical and Hollywood actress. Today, she is a practicing Catholic and a director of the David Horowitz Freedom Center.
We'll see you there.
She is the sister of Kate Millett, the American feminist and co-founder of NOW, the National Organization for Women. Mallory's sister Kate has been described by the New York Times as a seminal influence on second-wave feminism. She is best known for her book, Sexual Politics, published in 1970.
It was her Columbia University PhD thesis. And I was living with her and her Japanese husband in their loft on the Bowery. And we'd get up and have breakfast every morning, and she'd be working on her book, and she'd read me passages from her book, and we were all very excited about this. In fact, I titled the book. I was the one who came up with the title Sexual Politics. And it was immediately an instant hit. They put her on the cover of Time magazine. They called her the Mao Zedong of the women's movement. And of course, when my sister became famous, she got to know Simone de Beauvoir. She made a point of that because she worshipped Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, they became very, very good friends. And my sister would fly over to France all the time. Kate Millett and her Simone de Beauvoir and all of her pals, you know, would sit in their salons in Paris and have their little pipe dreams, their little utopian fantasies.
In my opinion, so long as the family and the myth of the family and the myth of maternity and the maternal instinct are not destroyed, women will still be oppressed. No, we don't believe that any woman should have that choice. No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Society should be totally different. No woman should be allowed this choice precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make it one.
Dr. Alice von Hildebrand is a renowned lecturer, author, television host, and retired professor of Hunter College. Her late husband, Dietrich von Hildebrand, is one of the most celebrated philosopher-theologians of our modern age. Her published works include The Soul of a Lion, a biography of her husband, and The Privilege of Being a Woman, the reflections of a true feminist.
The wolf is hidden in clothing, the liberation of women. And this liberation is nothing but slavery, because they give up their gift, this extraordinary gift of the collaboration between God and life, which is precisely what maternity is. The attack on femininity, the vicious attack on the beauty of motherhood. Let us go back to Genesis, when God created a man and a woman, which are superbly complementary. They're different, but their difference is enriching for one another, because it wasn't good for man to be alone. Man is made for communion, and communion means love, and love means self-giving. It is said Adam sees Eve, and he's enchanted, blood of my blood and flesh of my flesh. bone of my bone. And then he gives her a superb title, a title that should make every single little girl conscious of the fact that she's a little girl. Thank God. She's called the Mother of the Living, establishing a bond between woman and life, which is dictated by God himself. The serpent turned to Eve because was she the weaker one and therefore easier to conquer and to defeat. Being infinitely clever and much more clever than we are, he knew perfectly well that Eve had an immense influence on Adam. And as soon as she was conquered, he would follow suit, which is exactly what happened. Because she gives him the apple, he doesn't say, my dear wife, what do you mean? We're not permitted to eat it. He eats it. And then afterwards, a real coward, when God made reproaches to him, he said, the wife that you gave him. Therefore, the devil attacks Eve because she's a mother of the living. And he was a murderer from the beginning. No, therefore, there is a war between Eve and the devil, between life and death. And we have got to realize that what is happening today is a war on the beauty and greatness and femininity.
In 1983, the Catholic Church placed Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex on the index of prohibited books. The announcement was made in Osservatore Romano in an article entitled Immoral Existentialism. 3 years later, Simone died of pneumonia in Paris at age 78. She was buried next to Sartre at the Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris.
She claims that she was not born a woman. She claims she became a woman. Well, what that means is that when she was born, she had existence, but no essence. And the essence that she ended up having, she was given by the culture. And it's not a real essence, therefore. It was something given to her. She hadn't freely chosen it. And therefore, she could now freely choose whatever her essence might be. And so therefore, she was going to choose to be more like, if you'll pardon the interpretation, she would choose to be more like the first sex.
Alfred Charles Kinsey was born the oldest of 3 children, June 23, 1894, in Hoboken, New Jersey. His parents, Alfred Sr. and Sarah, were strict Methodists and of modest means. Alfred Jr. was a sickly child. After high school, he was forced by his father to study engineering at his old college, the Stevens Institute of Technology. But Kinsey chose to continue his education in applied biology at Harvard. There he chose Professor William Morton Wheeler to be his mentor. Kinsey would soon imitate his mentor by becoming an agnostic and a Darwinian evolutionist. In 1919,